The book by Sam Anderson is a wonderful pictorial statement called The Black Holocaust for Beginners. Sam Anderson, who started out in his youth as a member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, worked for the past 50 to 60 years in the Black Liberation Movement, and he's been part of the reparations movement of the United States and the global Pan-African world. Today, Sam Anderson will be speaking about reparations and liberation and the questions of reparative justice. In the past 10 years, I would say 20 years, since the World Conference Against Racism, the question of reparative justice, reparations, have come to the front of the political agenda. Although some sections of the society have attempted to close down this question of reparations, Sam Anderson will give some background on the historical and contemporary struggles for reparations among African peoples.
Most of us, particularly our young children, have no idea how great African people are. In other words, we don't know our history. We don't know that civilizations originate in Africa. We don't know science and mathematics and philosophy and religion and medicine. All of that stuff originated in Africa and evolved out as African people moved across the continents and then eventually had interchanging relations with people. We don't know, for example, that the first samurai in Japan was an African man. We don't know that, all right? But the Japanese know, because you go and you see the samurai that they depict as the first samurai is clearly an African man. Kinky hair, broad lips, big nose, African features. So our greatness is something that's in us, but many of us don't know it. And that's one of the tasks in the reparations movement, in the healing process, internal healing, is to get our children, our young generation, to understand that there is greatness in us. There is greatness and therefore genius, and therefore beauty. And so this is an important aspect in terms of understanding how we move forward with reparations. Internally, in terms of reparations movement in the 21st century, is our challenge is to forge unity without uniformity. And that does not mean that we unite with Uncle Ben Carson. Okay? We don't unite with him. We unite with Clarence Thomas. All right? But there are other people. There's Oprah Winfrey, right? Who's a multi-billionaire that we have unity with. There's Robert Smith, who's a multi-billionaire that we have unity with. You know, we clearly have unity with Robert Smith. For those who don't know, last week he announced in the graduation at Morgan State with 397 graduates, brothers at Morgan State. Morehouse. That he's going to clear their debt. That's roughly $40 million for that he's putting out to clear the debt of these young graduates. That ordinarily a billionaire has very little relationship with people who are poor, except that they became billionaires because they exploited the impoverished people. But the unique thing about an African American billionaire or an African billionaire is that they have the opportunity to help move forward their people in some way, shape, or form. They have that opportunity. And then for some of them, they realize that it's not only an opportunity, but an obligation. If they have their heads wrapped right, they know that it's not only an opportunity, but it's an obligation. And so the challenge is unity, and we've been struggling with that. The African Liberation Support Committee established itself in 1971-72, and one of the leaders that came out of that was Owusu Sadakai, who's now a right-wing Negro. I use Negro for short for never grow. Go figure. He's a Republican, right? So he flipped, but we still struggle for unity without uniformity. That is essential, and it's a complex development that we have to deal with. The reparations program is taking shape, right? It's developing, not only here in the United States, but throughout the Caribbean and in Europe and in Africa. And one of the major turning points of this reparation struggle was in the work up to the World Conference Against Racism. The work up to the World Conference Against Racism. That happened from 1997, was it, Horace, when they first started, 97 to 2001. There was a preparatory committee made up of Africans from the diaspora and Africans from Africa who came together periodically in Europe, in the United States, in the Caribbean, and Africa to plan the major gathering that would happen in Durban, South Africa. Years in the making. We go to Geneva often also. And in that, you had various forces coming together to deal with the issue of reparations and how that takes shape in their respective nations. And the issue in the broad sense of the healing process in terms of the internalization, the internal damage that internalized racism has played upon us as a people. So here, there's overriding demand for national cohesion and a coherent program to take millions of people within our communities to begin the real work of mass education and mobilization. This was something that people felt that was important in the year 2000, 2001, to build the at the grassroots level the question of reparations, for people to be knowledgeable of that. And one of the elders of that period who was advocating this for years, since, well, even prior to 1972, she was there, you saw a bit of her on the screen there, Queen Mother Moore. Queen Mother Moore, who cut her teeth in the Communist Party in the United States and saw racism there. She split from that and wound up working with primarily with black organizations, black nationalist organizations over the years. And she was one of the sisters who really got me thinking, because she would always come into a meeting, always, in the early 70s, reparations. First and foremost, she'd talk about reparations. And even if it was not on the agenda, that's what she was promoting, right, among black folk, reparations. And that's going to be essential. And that was in the 70s. And she said it in the 90s, in the 80s, and in the 90s. And then by the time the World Conference Against Racism happened, she was one of the big influences among many of us in the United States to say, oh, now she's making sense. Before, she wasn't making sense. Now she's making sense. So that's important to realize, yes. We know now that when we go into a black community anywhere on the planet, and particularly here in the United States, and have a conversation with people for 5 or 6 minutes about the issue of reparations. If they may not understand the word, you start to talk to them about what that means in terms of how our ancestors not working but not being paid, being super duper exploited. Afterwards, the 13th Amendment allowed for exploitation to go on. It says your folk are free, except if you're a prisoner, right? A prisoner, you're not free. And so we have a lot of black people in prison, not free. And people get it. The question is then, how do you get them involved? How do you get them to pass on the word about reparations, to support the reparations efforts coming up is a big issue, right? It's a big challenge. But as Horace said earlier, today in the United States, within the Democratic Party clown show, that's the presidential candidate, right? 25 of them, maybe 26. But one of the major points of discussion, fundamentally, we know that the foundation of capitalism is our ancestors and our ancestors' work. Okay, this is, by the way, is a Aetna Life Insurance Company, as it says, slave policy. Aetna Life could not exist. New York Life could not exist without slavery. They got the bulk of their wealth from putting quote unquote insurance on the slaves. Okay, our ancestors never received this. If the slave died, it didn't go to the son or daughter or the wife. It went to the master. Okay, so we know that our campaign is not about finding ways to reform capitalism. Because if you understand capitalism at its roots, its foundations, is us, our ancestors, body, mind, and womb. If it wasn't for the African woman's womb, we would not have had slavery, chattel slavery, as long as we had it. Every child out of an enslaved African woman womb was capital. No other economic system in the world ever did that. Even if the slave master's child came from the African woman, that slave master's child was capital first. Rarely my son or my daughter. Rarely. Understand, that's the base. Tens of thousands of African women, millions of African women, when you look at on the global scale, producing babies who were automatically enslaved. That's the root base of capitalism. And then that child, male or female, had a value, and plans were made for that child. By the time they're 3, they start to work in the fields or in the house, and then they work on. The average lifespan ranged from up north to 18, 20 years, and in the Caribbean, 7.5 years if you're doing the cane cutting. 7.5 years. If you're 15 years old, by the time you're 25, you're most likely dead. Okay, in that whole thing. So it's important that we understand the roots of that. We'll talk about that as we move on. Now, what does a reparations demand include? What are we demanding? Are we demanding cash money for every single African American who can point to an enslaved African in the United States? No. No, hell no. No. Once we calculate that up, You know, conservatively $2 trillion, and you spread that around to adults, to maybe 20 million adults, that cash money will go straight back to the capitalists. Am I right? Straight back. We have no economic foundation of our own in the United States. We have no economic base, foundation, corporations, businesses, you name it, of our own United States. Except for, huh?
Will we use as collateral for loans?
Oh, well, yes. We'll get to that. That's important. You know, that's important. Yes, but not cash. Not cash. That's one thing we don't want to have in the hands of black folk in the United States in the 21st century, right? Is that cash money, okay? Because it within 5 minutes, it no longer circulates in our community. It's gone, right? And there's no base, no buildup, okay? So the campaign includes compensation for the tens of thousands of black men and women in prison now and in the past. All right. The United States Steel Corporation, when they discovered coal and iron ore in Alabama during the time of Reconstruction in the 1880s, the United States Steel Corporation, set up a contract with the local prison system in Alabama to use the black labor, because that's mainly who was in prison at that time, black labor to extract the coal and iron ore. So United States Steel did not have to pay for that labor, and that labor only got paid pittance. You know, that black labor was, as I said, the 13th Amendment says you're free unless you are in prison, right? And so that labor helped push forward United States Steel. So United States Steel will be another, whatever it's called now, SSX, USX, whatever is the name they have now, we would pursue them for compensation for the slave labor that they used in Alabama. The reparations campaign will include a demand to cancel usury rates upon us through killer mortgages and loan shark credit card interest rates and the pay centers. You know, that is important, and how that would work is very simple, and it can be said because now everything can be digitized and so forth. You are a benefit. You have identified yourself as an African descendant of the formerly enslaved in the United States. You have that as part of your digital record. You go and want to buy a car, a brand new car. You go and you show your digital record, and you purchase that car without any taxes. Or you say, oh, that's impossible. That's not impossible. That's a possibility. That's a law. If we push the reparations demands, it's a law that every person of African descent who can identify themselves as descendants of African enslaved in the United States, you can get a automobile interest-free. You can get mortgages interest-free. And this happens, and we say, how long does it take? How long will this happen? How long will this be in effect? It'll be in effect until we reach economic parity with white people. Understand that? Economic parity with whites. Right now, the wealth of white folks and the wealth of black folks are greatly disparate, greatly so, and particularly with women. African women wealth on average in the United States, $5. $5. That's a crime. The typical African-American woman in the United States wealth is $5, okay? So, moving on. A campaign, African Americans pay no federal taxes. Native Americans pay no federal taxes. State or municipal taxes until there's economic parity between white America and black America. Precedent set, Native Americans pay no taxes. We don't have to pay, you know, why? Our taxes, you know, we were already taxed. Our ancestors were taxed. So we were at a disadvantage after slavery. The 40 acres and a mule was promised and never delivered. That would have brought equity within a generation. But it did not happen, okay? Yes. Campaign will demand that African Americans have access to free education, up to and including graduate studies, wherever one is accepted to study until there is educational parity, okay, between white America and black America. All right? That's also doable. Wealth in this country is greatly disparate, greatly. The creation of a reparations economic cooperative development bank to help develop, employ, and advance the black communities of the United States. As I said earlier, if we had cash in our pocket, you know, from reparations, each one of us got $50,000 or more, there is no black businesses that we could go, or very few black businesses that we could go to. And very few of them actually help develop our communities. You know, Syracuse, Rochester, Albany, New York City, Chicago, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, you name it. You go around to those communities and you see in the black communities underdevelopment and very little economic development plans that benefit us. The economic development plans that are actually being implemented in our communities in the 21st century are for gentrifiers, not for the residents, for the gentrification. Capitalism's avant-garde, if you will, into our community. And that doesn't help us. So we have some very brilliant economists among us, and that would be helpful. A reparation command will include a debt cancellation demand resonating throughout Africa and the diaspora. Cancel the debt that the Africans in the Caribbean and the diaspora, quote unquote, owe to the World Bank, the IMF, to Barclay, you name it. You know, or just cancel all of that. All right, because all that is super exploitation based, right? Making Africa, making the Caribbean grossly underdeveloped. And so we say that's part of our demand. Cancel that debt. That can be done. Campaign is a powerful tool to educate the people of the U.S. and the world societies about a brutal, savage system that is the basis for capitalism's institutional racism and white supremacist oppression today. It is the basis of capitalism. We can't get around being nice about capitalism. Capitalism comes out of an evil system, amoral system that was called chattel slavery. A reparations campaign will also demand the return of all stolen African descended art to their respectful homeland. Some of that is already slowly beginning to happen. One of the first acts that Nelson Mandela did when he became president of South Africa was to get the remains of Sister Saartjie Baartman, or Hottentot Venus, Venus Hottentot, back to Africa and have a proper burial. Why? Because the French kept her sexual apparatus, right? Kept her sexual organs on display, right? And then they took them off once people complained, but they still had them. They never returned them. So Mandela was able to get those back and have the proper burial for the sister. And there are many other people and institutions that have stolen art out of Africa and the diaspora. Now, this is what I had mentioned before. During slavery, African women were capital, producing capital with their minds, hands, and wombs. It's very, very important, very essential to understand the horrific reality of that undergirds what we call today capitalism. Yes. A reparations campaign will demand African Americans have access to free health care for one's entire life. We must never forget that our ancestral mothers and fathers were humiliated, tortured for the sake of the invention of gynecology and white male dominance over a woman's body. Okay? And that's J. Marion Sims, the so-called father of gynecology, about to conduct surgery upon an enslaved African woman who he and his colleagues believed felt no pain. You know, he was experimenting on, and we successfully got rid of the statue in New York City of J. Marion Sims that was located on Central Park, on Fifth Avenue in Central Park. A campaign, reparations, will educate our people of the fact that our ancestral fathers had to face systemic, humiliating attempts to strip them of their manhood and dignity, of which his horrific legacy resonates throughout U.S. cultural, governmental, and corporate institutions today. We know that. And there's some excellent work on prisons as forms of stripping down black manhood and so forth. And so that's something that we are see as very important in the healing process. A reparation campaign will demand compensation for the millions of black children forced into horrific death-inducing child labor from as early as 3 years old. All right, that's another form. You know, why reparations? Because of child labor starting at the age of 3, where the child worked from can't see to can't see, the age of 3. Reparations campaign will expose the additional injuries inflicted during slavery, the never-ending war against free blacks. They were unjust. Our free black people during slavery and after, they were catching hell everywhere. So for us who know our history, it is not shocking to see children separated from their families at the border. That was a normal process, a necessary process under chattel slavery. And that you can't extract that process from this society without facing it and by not just black people facing it, not just Latinos, Native Americans, but white people too facing it. That this happened, never happened, not happen again. Campaign is a self-reliant movement. It is a nation-building campaign that allows black people to address some of the fundamental issues confronting our survival today. And as we know, went around the country over the years discussing this is the battle to dismantle the racist prison industrial complex. Big demand here. We know today that 2 of the last remaining sisters, 63-year-old and 68-year-old Move 9 women from Philadelphia are released today. After 40 years in prison for literally resisting arrest. 40 years in prison, they finally were released from prison today in Pennsylvania. And we still have aging political prisoners in the United States. I'm 75. My colleagues who were in the Panther Party, when I was in the Panther Party, they're still in prison. Some are 80, some are 82, some are my age. Whereas the mafia people who murdered 10, 12 people, they're out, living large, right? And we know with the big bankers who ripped off people in 2008, 2009, criminals, they never went to prison. They got raises. So we have this demand ongoing. Okay, we're almost done. A reparations campaign is the most powerful weapon that can be used against racism and the right-wing onslaught on affirmative action and political disenfranchising, i.e. voting while black. You know, that's we don't have time, we can go on a lot of discussion on those two issues, affirmative action and voting while black. Yes. It has created a strategic bridge between Africa, the diaspora, blacks from Brazil, Costa Rica, Haiti, Venezuela, Colombia, Honduras, and throughout the Caribbean are currently joining the international reparations campaign by the thousands. We know that there are all these different movements, reparations movements developing in those areas. Okay, a reparations campaign is ultimately a political offensive. It is not nice. It is not going to be polite. It's a political offensive. We are politically fighting against an unprincipled force called capitalism, called white supremacy. So it's a political offensive, not just cultural, but primarily political. Yeah. Our challenge is to get our youth committed to join the struggle for reparations. The last thing I want to say about that is, if you looked at that document in 1972, the thousands of young black people out in there were young black people. They were not most of our ages in here. They were young by the thousands, in the leadership, moving the movement forward. The movement, the civil rights movement, was of young people. The Garvey movement was of young people. The movement, Harriet Tubman, when she first started, you know, going into the South and bringing people back, she was in her 20s. Was young, not us old folk. No, you know, so we have to find ways of revitalizing the black liberation movement in the United States, particularly in the United States, among the young people. And that's a challenge that we have to think through. That's a big, big challenge, because now our young people's minds can be easily distracted with social media, et cetera, et cetera. And then that's it, okay? Thank you. And I have a few books, 6 to be exact. One goes to the nation, and
Why don't you present it to her right now before
Yes.
we take it away from
Go
her?
ahead.
Please.
Yeah, I will.
Thank you very much.
All right, and I'll sign it.
I got a pen.
I got that.
Can we have a picture of? Can we have
Well,
There's Q&A?
yes, I think so.
Okay.
I'm sure there is. I'm sure there's Q. Please come up to the front here. We have some seats in the front here. We have a difficulty, Mr. Saul, because Mr. Vice President, we have the food that is there, but I know people have questions for our sister and for our brother. So I think we'll take a few questions, and then we will eat, and then we will come back for more discussion. What do you say, Madam President?
I think we can, have three questions and then people can talk while they're eating.
Okay, so I do think Sam Anderson has revealed to us that there is a global reparations campaign. And for us in Pan-African Community of Central New York, we understand that the reparations is not simply about money. The reparations campaign is a campaign which really begins with educating people about the crimes that have been committed. I think that I want to thank you, Sam, for giving us that background. And I'm sure that there are people who have questions and comments. And we will take your questions and comments for Sam and our sister Frida. So we welcome questions.
What do you think is the best way to get our youth involved in the struggle for reparations?
Okay, we'll take 3. Best way yet to get the youth involved in reparations. Please stand up and identify yourself, my sister. Go ahead. Yeah,
So I can ask you.
yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering.
Please identify yourself for us.
Oh, I'm sorry. My name is Viola Paris, and I've met you maybe in 2007 at the Math and Social Justice
Oh,
Conference.
yeah.
I just wanted, in looking at the work of Beckles
Mhm.
and the demands, how similar are the demands in terms of what's being done in the United States?
Okay, so there are two. Go ahead. Benjamin, please stand up and tell us who you are.
Yes, Benjamin actually from Cameroon and Canada.
And from Syracuse University. Engineering department.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Somewhere along the line, you were a bit soft on my ancestors. I'm from Cameroon. Some chiefs have already begun recognizing their role in this nation. You were a bit soft, and I think that's a very typical approach from African Americans. But the downside of that is that that problem continues today.
Mhm.
The liberation you brought, the liberation your activism brought to us in the 60s
Mhm.
is lost.
Yeah.
Because I was hoping to see in the reparation also that the money the politicians of Africa have hidden in European banks, that money should be brought back. So to what extent can we continue to be soft on the African who is the enemy of his own brother,
Right.
enemy
Good.
of his own sister?
Yeah.
Thank you. There you have 3 questions.
All right. The first one was
Youth. What can be done about the youth?
the youth. First one about the youth. That's something that Horace and I have talked about. You know, it's always been, I guess for the past 35 years, for many of us, a major challenge. And to me, I think we have to start with our own children and their peers, and in our neighborhoods where we are. You know, we cannot rely, unless we know people in them, the public school system to do the teaching and the necessary consciousness raising of our youth. It has to start with us, and that's a very tedious process, very long process. It has to start with us. And wherever little oases we have in the school system, we try to get our children there. But one of the major stumbling blocks that I mentioned in passing was the social media event. You know, the contradiction is our children now, more than just 10 years ago, have access to the internet. And in the internet, you have a lot of good stuff that helps us raise the question about anything about that, where to look. You have to have the question in your head. So is social media driven miseducation is what we have to challenge. And I believe we encourage our friends and families to, you know, find ways, show how young people can just still use the internet, even social media, to get into something of more substance. And also, the other thing is, we have to have a vision for our children in our community and in our family that is beyond just getting a good paying job. That they need to recognize that they are living in a crisis, a global environmental crisis, a global crisis of white supremacy, a global crisis of super exploitation, et cetera, right? That they're living in that. And that it's up to them, not us old folk, it's up to them to change that crisis. But that's something we have to do piece, student by student, family member by family member, community by community, neighborhood by neighborhood, block by block, if you will. And that takes organization, which some of us have in some places. The other aspect that underlies that also is the religious institution in which we may belong, be it a mosque or a church or whatever, they have to play a role in this. Traditionally, in the black community, from let's say the 60s backwards, the church was based on liberation theology. Now, the church is based on prosperity theology, right? And so we have to intervene in that also, especially for those of us who have a religious base in our families and so on. But it's a challenge. And I think there are people doing it. There are some people doing it. And we need to, and that's the other thing, network with them. Find out who they are and network with them. The second question.
About the Caribbean Reparations Commission.
Yes.
And its lessons.
Yeah. The University of West Indies, Glasgow reparations thing is something that we can look at. Like I said, I don't have the details right now, but the details will be forthcoming, and we all can, obviously it'll be public, we all can look at that and see what is the in-kind in this, and what is the monetary aspect of it. I know, for example, Princeton, Lincoln, over a century, had a relationship. It was more paternalistic, racist paternalistic, than anything else with Lincoln University. That relationship, that base, now can, we could discuss, given the precedent set, compensation from Princeton to Lincoln. But it has to be organized at the Board of Trustees level. The president has to, be in agreement with that. Somebody has to lay out the specifics. Lincoln University is in dire need of blah, blah, boom, boom, boom. And Princeton has the ability to give A, B, C, and D, that kind of thing we worked out. At every historically black college and every historically white college that had slavery money at its base, that can be worked out. The devil is in the details in that, okay? Third question.
About the responsibility of Africans in the reparations.
I glossed over, when I mentioned Rodney's thing, it was glossed because I didn't want to go so much into that detail about the evolution of the slave trade and how corrupt African leadership became an essential component of that in the latter part of the slave trade, and then how the colonizers used that corruption, that leadership, to further put their claws in the land in Africa, and that divide and conquer aspect, with Nigeria, northern part and the southern part, and the houses, and all of those things, were worked on it. Yes, we do have corrupt people among us. Some of the first two names I invoked were people Negroes who we don't support at all, Uncle Ben Carson and Clarence Thomas. The same thing happens in Africa. You have corrupt people in Africa. They're human beings, right? But what I was emphasizing was the overall structure of the international slave trade was those things that Rodney had listed. And dominated. The minority were these corrupt Africans. And then what happened often was some of those Africans were corrupt. They did their duty, and the Europeans took them on the ship anyway. But no, I thought you were partners. Okay.
Okay, thank you. I should add, Viola, that the Caribbean 10-point program for reparations have some real intangible things. Let me give you one example of the 10-point program.
Intangible?
Yes, for example, health. that, for example, the incidence of hypertension among African descendants in the Caribbean and North America are excessively high because of the transatlantic slave trade.
Yeah.
And one of the aspects of the relationship between Edinburgh University and university is to increase the research on health and to produce health therapies in the black community in relationship to hypertension and these questions. So we minimize the question of reparations when we think only of money, because the question of environment, healthcare, bodily care, and the whole aspect of how the society is organized. Let's take 3 more questions, please.
Being in monetary or in kind is being recycled or is being sustained. I don't know if I missed that point, but I was thinking that there could be also for especially the continental Africans, because as we can see, this is not just a struggle for black people in the diaspora, but also continental Africans. And so I missed the element of how getting all this inputs coming in, being money or some service, is helping to develop the basis, because everything I believe is coming from our consciousness. If the kids are not getting that consciousness, then this is not going to be sustained. Because I believe whoever owns the mind owns the person. And so if we are not finding a way to somehow channel some of this resource for the development of a young black community, then I don't see how this is going to be sustained. Because I think we're going to have the resource, but it's going to be remaining at the top level and not getting research, especially for the development, more specifically for the conscious development of the black people.
Thank you.
You talk about development of the child's mind or development of the community. It was confusing in what you were saying.
Sustainability.
Yeah.
How do you
The
sustain?
conscious development of the child's mind to understand for the continuity of this process.
I'm still not clear on it.
I think,
Yeah.
to give an example, Horace just talked about Glasgow partnering with a university to do research on hypertension.
Yeah.
So if this research is done by researchers of a different community, you have not got some sustainability to the
Right. Yeah.
So if you include in that the training of medical students from the community,
Yes.
and they will have that kind of history and they can continue.
Yes.
to continue. So the human capital is developing, and the logic behind it is also.
Yeah. That's part of the broader picture of that cooperative economic development bank, and the education component. In that broad category, you have in the various communities these institutions that would bring in young people as apprentice or interns, and so the young people will be in a different environment that's positive, that has black expertise that they can work with. The same thing would happen, which is a much bigger challenge, is in the public education system. The public education and the reparations is that, for example, there are more white teachers in black communities than ever before, everywhere in the United States, right? How do we reverse that? How do we get more black teachers in schools where there are black children? And that's a demand in which the local school budget can set aside to be part of a campaign that is a campaign that starts in the elementary school on one level, encouraging young people, young black kids, to become teachers, and guaranteeing that they wouldn't have to worry about tuition and so forth, because if they graduate from high school and go to college as an education major, as long as they're in good standing, their tuition is paid for. Okay? The other end, on the other end, at the same time, because that's a 12-year development to get teachers, minimum, 12 minimum. On the other hand, you start a campaign where money is set aside, advertising, encouraging young people, black, male and female, to become teachers and have salaries that are attractive to them coming into the school system. Sort of a reverse Teach for America. Teach for America is one where millions and millions of dollars are set aside to bring white teachers, instant white teachers, into schools of color, primarily. Instant, 6-8 weeks, boom, you're a teacher. We're not saying to do that. We're saying that we know that to become an excellent teacher, you have to go through a process that takes many years to become an excellent teacher. You have to go through undergraduate school, and you have to go into a school of education, and or undergraduate within the school of education to become an excellent teacher. And we set up a program to attract young black students who ordinarily would say, well, I'm going into business, and and that's just a vague area, and they come out and become a glorified secretary or administrative assistant. So we need a campaign on that. The reparations campaign movement would incorporate that, would encourage that in our communities, to challenge the mindset of our young people that it's part of our duty to contribute to our community, and one way you can do that is by becoming a teacher. The last question here. White people are the primary sources of anti-racist work. We are the secondary, if not tertiary. It's white people that have to deal with those white kids. That's straight on. We can only be secondary or tertiary. We can give advice and so forth. But in order for it to be internalized, right, unless that white child grows up in the black community, it's a different story. But if that white child is coming out of a white community, progressive, anti-racist white people, that is their task.
All right. Thank you so much.
One other thing, if anybody's interested, I have a PDF version of this, I can send it to you, okay?
Frida, please.
Yeah. I wanted to speak county. The St. Marie among the Iroquois place on the lake, we've transformed it. With the idea came from Sandy Bigtree and Phil Arnold. Phil Arnold works at SU in religion. And the idea was, let's tell people who we are. So it is a good place to go. You'll see my face in there. There's several videos. And what we do is try to teach our worldview, our ways of Thanksgiving, and our history. So you can get a lot of the history at the Scano Center. It's called Scano Center because Scano means peace. Because on that lake is where our peacemaker came and brought us together as a confederacy. So it's a very important place in our history. So it's a perfect place to tell our story. So you're welcome to go to the Scano Center. It's open from a Wednesday to Sunday, 10 to 4, and I think it's just $5 to attend. So yeah, it's been quite the experience because we've had to work with the Onondaga Historical Society and the county. So that's interesting. ways, you know. One just wanted to show history like museums do, and we wanted people to understand the basic thoughts and understandings behind our ways, and we had to work at making that happen. Okay.
Thank you so much. I would like, on behalf of the audience, to thank you so much for gracing me with your presence, and to thank all those who assisted in bringing you out here. And Sam, thank you for coming up from New York, and all of you coming from Chicago, from all. I really want to say this was a very important African Liberation Day. And to the members of Pan-African Community of Central New York, please stand so the audience can know who you are. Please, members of Pan-African Community of Central New York, please stand to the people who helped to organize this event. There's one other member of the Pan-African member of Central New York who is not here. He's a great Pan-African leader who was on our executive, our sister Mishira Mogo. And I want us to send a big spiritual message to her from this meeting, that in her tribulation we are there with her. And we can send that to Mumbi, her daughter, that although she's not here physically, in spirit you know she's here, because you know she's facing the challenges that all of us have to face someday. So thank you, Mumbi, and please pass the information to her. That although she's not here,